Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us today. Thank you so much for joining on this 31st edition of the CVC Insider Series. Today, we have a very special ahead together with Claudia Zeisberger, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Family Enterprise at INSEAD, and best-selling author and advisor to the venture ecosystem. Claudia has some wonderful insight into how to make CVC work, and she'll be sharing her unique thoughts today. But before we get started, I wanted to quickly set the stage so you all have some context. First of all, my name is Alba, and I'm part of 500 Global, previously known as 500 Startups. 500 Global is one of the world's most active seed stage investors with over 2,500 direct investments into startups from 75 countries. And within 500, I work closely with the corporate investor and innovator network to power their projects, partnerships, and investment into startups. And we started the CVC Insider Series now over a year ago as part of our efforts to help raise the bar in the corporate venturing world and build a stronger, more supportive environment for startups and investors alike. So every 2 weeks, we get together and host this roundtable featuring some of the world's top corporate venturing practitioners and sharing their unique insight into the CVC landscape, some of the best practices that they've gathered around the way. And so if you'd like to nominate any speaker, please feel free to let us know. And our wonderful host, Nicolas Sauvage, will be moderating our discussion. But there's also a Q&A function, so feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll do our best to cover them. So now that you know what's going on, I'm going to pass it on to Nicolas. Nicolas, take it away and enjoy.
Thank you, Alba, and thank you, 500 Global. Like Alba mentions, we invite top CVC practitioners. Today is going to be an exception. We're going to talk to someone who is really an expert in corporate venturing, but from a very different angle as people who are working in a corporate VC. And I've talked with Claudia, I've read what she writes about. It's going to be an amazing discussion. She has very diverse opinions about corporate venturing, and I think we're going to learn a lot. But first, Claudia, do you mind introducing yourself maybe for 5 minutes about why are you so interested in corporate venturing and what was your journey into that topic?
Thank you very much, Nicolas. It is a pleasure, and I'm honored to be invited. So, especially at the annual anniversary of the show, thanks to 500 Global for hosting this as well. So, always a pleasure to be back. So, what interests me in on the corporate venturing side in the widest sense? It probably started about 5-6 years ago when we saw at INSEAD, and specifically me, because I look after anything private capital related, more and more interest emerging from the traditional corporates, and not necessarily from the tech corporates, but from the consumer corporates, banking corporates, and so on, that came to us and said, we would really like to talk about corporate venturing. And I use that term at this stage really, really broadly in the widest sense, and help our board think through that. Should we be part of it? If we dip our toes into it, how can we do it in a way that is potentially as de-risked as possible, because we want to be part of it, but we want to experiment with it. And does it mean we should do corporate venture capital? Should we set up an incubator or an accelerator? Should we just focus on merger and acquisitions and just pick and choose? And by the way, how do we create the right kind of sample menu to pick and choose from if we want to play on that end of the spectrum, if you like? So it became clear that there was more and more demand. I mean, as you see more and more corporates asking the same question, obviously, we kind of realizing that there's a role to be played. So we then brought a few corporates around the table. We started looking into an executive education program, which we launched in February this year. And so that's on the INSEAD side. On the personal side, I've seen basically the story around corporates really evolve, and not just from the conversation with the boards, but also from questions from the startups that I'm engaging with. More and more startups would come and say, hey, Claudia, we're raising our next round, and we have a couple of term sheets, but one of the term sheets is a corporate behind it. Can you help us even think about this? Should we consider them? Is this a good investor? Because you're always adamant, as I am usually in my conversations, that venture investors need to bring more than just capital to the table. Money is not a differentiator anymore. I think in 2021, it's probably more true even than in 2016. So there was basically that interest as well. And then as I started reaching out to some of the corporate VCs that were already in the game, I had often conversations that went along the line, yeah, we've been doing whatever we're doing, but it's not working. So, or, you know, we think we should do better, or we haven't really achieved what we wanted to achieve. And that always became an interesting conversation for me, because then obviously my question would be, putting my academic hat on, let's collect what's not working, or let's try to find those that have made it work. And maybe there's value in sharing it. So, and that has been kind of a really, really interesting journey. I have to say, I would have never thought in 2015, 16 that we would see such a kind of hockey stick chart projection in terms of new CVCs coming in, money being deployed out of CVCs, number of deals being done, percentage of CVC deals in the US. It's stunning, I have to say. I was positive about it. I was excited about the corporates coming in, but I would have never thought that it would grow that much. So, yeah, interesting.
It's extremely surprising. There's such an uptick. It's really faster than anything that one could expect. And so maybe the question I'm going to ask is the toughest one. Why do you think there's such an uptick?
So I think corporates nowadays have no choice. And what I mean is they have no choice to step out and be aware of what happens outside their own ecosystem. So they cannot afford to lose sight of the developments, the potential threats emerging from the outside. So I think at an absolute base minimum, corporates need to observe what is happening in the startup ecosystem. And this basically includes not just startups that are really close to what they're doing, what we call Horizon 1, but you need to really think about what you do in your context in a much, much more global, broader, wider sense. So we're going from Horizon 1 all the way to Horizon 3. How you do that, though, is a complete different conversation. There are many ways on how you can engage and be aware and observe that ecosystem. You can remain an observer, but obviously, as always, the more hands-on you are, the more you get involved, the more you're willing to engage and potentially make mistakes and learn from them as well. To me, this is really, really important. So ultimately, I think as a corporate, you have no choice nowadays. So simply because it is a way for you to observe, but more important, to learn. And that learning may impact how you do your internal R&D, how you restructure your internal R&D team. So I think it's going to be really important going forward in the next 5 to 10 years to see how those corporates observe what's going on the outside, but then connect it back to what they're doing internally. And that's not easy.
Yeah, I think it's very provocative. They have no choice. And today, so I'm at the Global Corporate Venturing event today in Monterey. I met with many, many CVCs. And it's to the point where when we talk to fellow CVCs, we're like, it would be very hard for us to understand why a Fortune 2000 does not have a CVC today. We're getting so much learnings and insights we can share back to the mothership. Can you think of any single reason why a Fortune 2000 should not have a CVC?
So I think it ultimately, and we spoke about that before, in the past, it starts with a clear definition of why you want to do that. And it starts by asking yourself on the board level, what do we think we're missing? So what do we think we're missing? And then which part of corporate venturing can help us to close that gap? So what are we missing? Are we missing visibility? Are we missing real execution? I mean, would our R&D team, would our engineers, our internal team, would they benefit from some engagement with some external engineers, maybe with some devil's advocates? Maybe our engineers can play devil's advocate with some of those new development, with some of the startups out there, and there's learning there as well. So I think if you say, okay, we're good, we feel we're on top of it, we have the knowledge, we have the visibility, maybe even we have the intelligence that we need, and kind of, you know, we are aware, and we can execute. We have a firm belief in our confidence in our execution capability in terms of R&D. I mean, then I would say, you know, you seem to be okay. You're on top of it. You're getting the intelligence that you need. No need to basically add on to it. I would strongly encourage those corporates, though, to be honest and to circle the wagons on a regular interval and say, is that still the case today? Because we've seen certain industries very quickly being disrupted from being reasonably observers. I mean, even kind of old hardcore industries like the oil industry now, the commodities industry, they are being now disrupted by requests for, you know, ESG compatibility. Yep. And all of a sudden, I mean, that's kind of new, and that's really, to some extent, hits potentially even the share price right now, because investors are starting to put up screens that they didn't put up even 12 months ago. So I think the world is clearly changing. We all know that, faster than ever before. So at regular intervals, you need to ask yourself, whatever you think you're doing internally, whatever knowledge you're gathering, whatever awareness you have, is it still appropriate? Is it still timely? Maybe is it still enough?
I think you gave a really good, sophisticated answer, because I was thinking about two very good companies that keep innovating, that don't have a CVC. There's no Apple Ventures and there's no Tesla Ventures. And they would fit in what you would argue are companies that have managed to keep innovating. Maybe a CVC is not what they need, and they have all the right antennas to do it. But most companies don't have that, and therefore a CVC would be a smart tool in the innovation tool set.
Yeah, I think it's kind of it's a good starting point to just ask yourself in terms of intelligence. How much are you gathering? How much are you aware? Or basically, you can also do a post-mortem and ask yourself, in the last 5 years, how often have you been disrupted? How often have you been surprised by developments? So the more often that happens, the less likely you can argue that whatever you're doing in terms of intelligence gathering is still enough.
Very nice. And earlier you mentioned you have more and more corporate VCs coming to you saying it's not working. And here I want to understand, how much of that do you think comes from not having defined the why well, and how much of that is more on the execution side?
I would argue it's probably 75–80% execution, but there is a significant portion still on the why. So, and maybe, I mean, to give them credit, maybe there was at one point a conversation around the why, but in the meantime, the internal champion has changed, the CEO has changed, maybe the whole economy around it, the whole entrepreneur environment has changed, and they just never went back to the why. So I think there is the why at the beginning when we set out, as we just discussed, but also there's a regular circling back of saying, is our why still appropriate? Is it still meaningful what we put out as a target? But I firmly believe execution is ultimately make or break, at the risk of sounding very German. So, but you know, everyone, as we know, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So let's basically look at execution. And I think one thing is super important to understand in the context of corporate venturing. One element of execution is probably the most important one. That's the internal communication, the internal PR almost, so that it's very, very clear to all your business units what is this corporate venture capital thing doing? What is this team doing? When should I go to them? Is there something where they can actually help me as the leader of a business unit to execute on my KPI? In which case, you obviously, if you can argue that and explain that, you will have incoming requests. But also, there has to be a relationship building mode inside the CVC, almost maybe an internal PR head that basically goes around and says, you know, this is what we're seeing. Is this interesting for you? Or ideally someone that knows exactly when he or she comes back from a conference, from a conversation with a startup potentially, to say, I know exactly who I need to talk to inside the organization. So I think the connectivity internally will, over the mid to long run, make or break a corporate venture capital effort. Now, let me ask, to put it into context, and one of my colleagues has done research on that. Looking back in 2015, the failure rate of corporate venture capital investors was tremendous. So, I mean, she showed that 80% of corporate venture capital vehicles or efforts closed down within less than 5 years. And I always get asked about why is that? And my answer is, and there would be a study to be done around that, is that it has to do with the tenure of CEOs. New CEO comes in, new sheriff in town, new different vision on execution and so on. And since the CVC is usually considered non-core, it's an easy one to kind of open and close very quickly. But I think at that point, and as the leadership change happens, it's super important to have shown that you have your kind of tentacles inside the organization as well. You have your connectivity. You need your kind of fan base internally that will come back and say, no, we need those guys, right? They're really useful. You know, they may be useful only once or twice a year to us, but when they're useful, they're really useful. This is good information for us to have.
I think you have given a few golden nuggets, as I call them. But I really like the concept of internal peer. And it's interesting because in the last 2 days, I probably talked to more than 50 CVCs in different groups. And the many that are challenged inside the mothership, inside their corporation, is really because they have not yet articulated wide enough, and I like the concept of fan base, they haven't articulated wide enough what they are learning and sharing back to the organization. And some of them do really well to share the information, but they only share it to the C-suite, which means that the people in the middle management who are actually in charge of the P&L challenge why there is a CVC. And so I think the internal peer concept is extremely important. And I think what you're saying, and I'm going to add some granularity, and then we will double click on it. There is one part of the internal peer, which is about sharing what you learn. So you show the value of the corporate VC from a strategic value point of view. And then there is the other one, which I think is what you implied by tentacles, which is all this connecting tissue between you and the organization and the portfolio companies, and maybe even startups you don't invest in, but you engage with. So with that granularity in mind, how much of the internal peer should be about the strategic value you bring and all the connecting tissue with startups that you bring? And you could argue both are strategic value, but they have very different angles in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the internal part, I think you really need to balance it. I mean, it's always easy to test this, right? I mean, if you say, okay, this is a spectrum and where should the lever sit, right? So internal kind of communication versus connecting with the outside. I don't think you can move the lever to only one side or the other. Right. If you're only engaging with startups, then clearly you're not going to get to your next fund, or you're not going to make it even to year 4. So on the other hand, if you're purely inward focused, that's not your role. So, and then you're not bringing that knowledge, your intelligence gathering, your funnel will run dry very, very quickly. So I would argue the engagement has to be balanced. And maybe at the beginning, when you're kicking off, let's say you're a startup CVC, you clearly need to ensure that the message goes out to the broader ecosystem. We are here. We're new. Please engage with us. I mean, as we know, disregarding CVC, just on the VC side, what separates the wheat from the chaff, the good from the not so good VCs, it's deal flow. So ultimately, especially if you're playing on the really early stage, there's no way to kind of really find those startups. I mean, you don't know which garage to look at around the globe where the innovation is happening. So you need to create a certain visibility to the outside. So if I'm a consumer startup, I know exactly which consumer parent companies have a CVC that I should be talking to. So that has to go out, and that's potentially a starting point. But on the other hand, it's crucial because that generates the funnel for you then to filter the knowledge and then distribute it internally as well. So you also have a certain filtering mechanism, but it does require, you're right, it requires a certain balancing act. And it also requires that you have a team that obviously is skilled and at either collecting information or distributing, or both, depending on how you're structured internally. So yeah, the external communication is a really tricky one. And obviously there, I should add, your credibility to the outside, to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, will be built over time because it grows as you engage with entrepreneurs, as you work with them, word will spread. As you lead that startup potentially to not only its next round, but maybe even to an amazing exit. And the exit may have nothing to do with your corporate. And to be honest, by that time, that exit may have turned out to be not even relevant for the corporate. So, but you have built your credibility in that ecosystem that you actually can handle a startup, and that you are a good investor, a nice investor, that startup entrepreneurs will say, yeah, we wouldn't mind having them on the board. We wouldn't mind having them on the cap table.
I like to think about a good corporate VC is first a good financial VC that will really take care of entrepreneurs, and then have a special power that comes from the mothership. And what I'm thinking is the entrepreneur should be thinking about getting a syndicate like multiple Avengers, each with a different special power, and all combined become extremely powerful. Do you have some advice for the corporations when they set up their CVC to make sure that the CVC doesn't feel constrained by the corporation, but actually they are enabling a special power?
Yes, I mean, I think it always goes back to the point that from the beginning on, you've got to be very clear. So when you're sitting down, when you're being approached by an entrepreneur and they're saying, okay, we'll be interested in you coming in, here's how much we're raising, would you be part of the round, could you lead? So the usual conversations. Very quickly, the next conversation will be, once we get comfortable with each other, what else can you do for us? And that's basically where the entrepreneur should come to you with kind of his menu items. This is what I'm going to do in the next 24 months. At that point, you will need to be able to say, okay, on point number 2, I think we could connect you with someone that would be really interesting for you to have a conversation with. So, but that requires from you that you are confident when you're making that statement that you can execute on it. That requires that you have as a CVC, that you know when you call on that engineering unit, business unit internally, that they actually will pick up the phone and that they will take the call from that entrepreneur. And that can mean many things. Spend a day with them, bring them in, maybe just have a call. But I think it's really important that the CVC at that point does not overpromise and underdeliver. So they have to be very, very clear. And it goes back again then, that's where your internal PR comes in handy. Yep. Because not only are those PR guys building a fan base, distributing knowledge internally, as they're doing so, they're also basically learning where the pain points are in certain business units. So they should know very quickly. It shouldn't be like, oh, we bring this new startup in, let's tell all our business units. Okay, so I mean, maybe you're gonna get a call. So usually I find that those blanket, mass emails usually don't go anywhere unless I send an email and say, dear Nicolas, I think you should have a look at this. This is a much better approach, because then also the other party has a much lesser likelihood of not responding or not replying. So I think that's really important, that you can deliver on your promise.
And I think part of that is related to what you said, which is building the fan base. Because if you have fan base where you build goodwill, you really understand what they like and what they don't like, you know when to reach out to them. And if you really know what they're interested in, they are going to react, they are going to appreciate, they're going to even give more. So I think this internal peer, building the fan base inside your organization is a golden nugget. Now, one thing you mentioned, which, I mean, this is the hockey stick of number of corporate VCs. And it's interesting because I see two trends at the same time. I see the corporate VCs that have, let's say, 5 years or more, becoming more and more professionalized. They become better and better at becoming a good citizen, good for entrepreneurs. They become better valued inside the corporation. And then you start to have these huge waves of new CVCs, which probably starting to be, I haven't looked at the number, but probably more than half of the CVCs of today have been created in the last 2 years.
Yeah,
and
I think
that sounds about right. And they don't come with all the best practices and the network. And like you said, maybe the corporations feel they have no choice, they have to do it now. And so I feel like there is a trend of the older version of CVCs becoming better and better at what they do, and all the new CVCs that come. And when I started TDK Ventures, many people said CVCs don't have good reputation. And so you can't afford to make one mistake. If you make one mistake, people will say, oh yes, of course you're a CVC. What would you advise to all these thousands of new CVCs that are being created in the last 2 years in making sure they don't make a mistake, but they actually, where would you guide them to make sure they don't make mistakes, but also they are going in the right direction?
Okay, so first I would say, right, as you said, I mean, we have CVCs that have been around for a really long time. So don't ignore history. Learn from the mistakes and learn from the success stories that have been made in the past. There is a reason why certain VCs are still around, CVCs are still around, and why others are not. So keep an eye on that. I mean, history may not repeat itself, but certainly there are lessons to be learned, and certainly it rhymes in some form or the other. I would basically advise them as well to be very clear with your corporate what they would like out of you, and ensure that this clarity is being double clicked on, as you call it, that we go back and that we're still aligned with the mandate. Then also be very clear with the startups that you're engaging in. Don't overpromise, always over deliver. And again, think about how your structure potentially may influence your decision making. So for example, are you a CVC that can make decisions independently? To what extent does your, for example, corporate CFO have a say in it? How fast are you in making decisions? So that's one of the things that I'm hearing from startups as well. CVCs take a really long time to make a decision. That is just not doable. You have to basically, despite being a CVC, you got to be aware and you got to play with the best practices that the other VCs are bringing to the table. So to me, it's really, really important. Be aware of the industry best practices. And that is not CVC, that is VC industry best practices. Be aware on how it's changing. And we've had plenty of changes in VC as well, not just on the CVC side. Be aware of your ecosystem. So, and we've talked about the startups, but I think you should be just as well aware and build, alliances, friendships with the VCs, because in venture investing, you will be sitting on boards where VCs will join. You will be joining boards where VCs are already there. You may be helping a startup to raise follow-on funding. So there it comes in handy if you're playing in the round A space, that you have some friends in round B and C bucket. So clearly super important to really build your ecosystems. and be aware of what is required of you. Maybe one thing to add on to it here, and that's a conversation to be had, and we'll see how this will play out. Some of the CVCs have started to set up very independent from the corporate, or have actually decided to become quite independent from the corporate. They may still be described as a CVC, simply by definition that they only have one LP, which is only the corporate, but they have become really independent in their mandate. So there may not even be a great mandate on the strategic side. So again, that lever has been moved much more to the point where we're saying, okay, we want to behave, we want to act, we're going to act like a true blue VC, not so much like a CVC. And our parent seems to be comfortable enough to get enough value out of observing our portfolio, maybe having conversations, but being a much looser connection there. So to me, this is interesting to see in its early days, how those very, very independent CVCs will fare over the long run. So my concern there is a little bit that the corporate over the long run may not get what they want out of the CVC, or may see not as much value, because obviously with those independent entities, the tentacles inside the corporate are naturally potentially looser or fewer.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point. You say maybe the corporation gets more and more comfortable, but I think when that happens, it's because the corporations start to pay less attention to the CVC, and the team inside the CVC wants to have more independence. But if you go back to the why of the CVC, it's very likely that getting more independence, more towards financial VC, is not fitting with the why. It fits with becoming better at working with entrepreneurs, working faster, making better decisions, working better with financial VC. All of that is good to do and you have to do. But I don't think that gets to the why of the mothership, which I think is what you say. Then they start to lose that strategic value, which was the starting point of having a corporate VC.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with you, but there's a trend there. So we'll see how that trend evolves. We can do a retake in 5 years' time and look back.
I think we will. And part of this loose connection is also because for a good corporate VC, you need to be this good financial VC first, in a way, or first or at the same time. I'm not sure, people would probably argue that. And part of that is to understand the power law, which is not understood by a corporation. But also, I think you said it well, it's about working well with the entrepreneurs, but also working well with the financial VCs. And there are things that corporations will think are obvious goodness, like, for example, linking an investment with an NRE project. It sounds like a win-win project. It's a win for the entrepreneur, he's getting on top of dilutive funding, a non-dilutive amount of money. It's good for the corporation that gets a startup to do the right thing. But it's actually a win-win-lose, because for the financial VC who are in the syndicate, they may not actually get the startup to do what would be maximizing value for the startup. So let's change gear a little bit and talk about diversity. How do you see the trends today? And it nearly feels like sometimes a pendulum. So you see improvements and you start to feel good about it, and then it starts to go back. How do you feel about building the right practice and the right support so that diversity has a fighting chance to last versus just being on the upswing and then come back?
Yeah. So, the trend towards diversity or across the board, diversity, equity, inclusion is clearly there. And so there are many, and maybe I'm usually a glass half full kind of person, but maybe I'm too optimistic. But I think from some of the developments that I've seen, it may have a bit more staying power than similar efforts have had in the past. So let me point to a couple of things. Number one, even though the starting numbers may not look good right now, when we look at diversity and on the VC side, diversity on the startup side, female founders, and so on. So number one, this has become a very clear talking point. I've seen LPs ask VCs during fundraising, what is the composition of your existing portfolio? So how many female founders do you have? And I think the LPs are also getting a bit smarter. So not just how many women are in that startup, but how many female founders, which is a really, really good question to ask. So I hope all the LPs listening will do so. So, but then the next thing, we've seen certain efforts. I mean, you've had in California efforts years ago on moving women on boards, number of women on boards. I think by next year, every company must have added a woman onto the board. We're also seeing now that the conversation around diversity does not just stop with women. Now I've seen quite a few efforts being made on venture funds that are focusing on investments in founders from Latin America. So, which is something that is, I would argue, reasonably new. There are very, very few VCs that had that on their kind of mandate 5 years ago. We've also seen a lot more VCs that are focusing purely on female founders. So as a mandate, and there's a good argument to be made aside from the altruistic one, that if we're arguing that female founders receive less funding, that should mean as a VC that I should be able to A, get more deal flow if I'm willing to actively look for women, and B, I may have less competition when I show up to those to those startups run by women. So there should be a straight logic to it. And then you will have seen, I mean, NASDAQ has recently come out and said, hey, you know, we're going to come up with some guidelines for all those companies that are listed on our board. And we will have certain requirements, and they are going way beyond female board members. So, and those are, from the way I understand it, and I just had a call with two colleagues. One of them comes from the legal background, so I trust her more than my judgment when I read this. But it seems to be right now simply a request to disclose, which again basically will put the onus ultimately on the investor side. So as an investor, I now have all the information. I can choose which of those NASDAQ listed companies I will invest in or not, depending on their kind of measure or ranking on the diversity scale. So this is early days. I do not think it has been implemented yet, but I think I'm encouraged by those efforts, because ultimately only what gets measured gets done. If you give me a good measure, I as an LP can make decisions that take those measures into account.
I can't agree more. I think first, it's very encouraging, and what you measure, you can improve. I think the challenge is gender is super straightforward to measure. There are many aspects of diversity which is much more difficult to measure, and which is also very dependent on geography. Is there some guidance you would give in terms of measures on diversity beyond gender that could be extremely helpful for VCs, for LPs, to really watch and to ask actually to have visibility of?
Yeah, I mean, there is, to me, what matters the most, and I've just done work with a private equity firm on measuring various aspects. Diversity was one of them in their portfolio companies. And it was a very diverse portfolio. So again, across the board, not industry specific. So number one, I would argue, you gotta be very mindful of the industry specificities. So for example, if you have a company that's heavily engineering focused, usually, I mean, you go around the world and you go into engineering classes at universities, you're lucky if you find more than 25, 30% women. Right. And usually this is very different in year one than it is in year 4. So usually the number tapers off. But so I would basically be mindful of the industry to make it meaningful. I would also basically define what diversity means to you very clearly. So for example, I mean, we could go into a company and say, okay, let's have a look how many women you have. And we can count this, and we can get very excited about it because it may be 30%. But let's overlay that with seniority and rank. because it's not just, do we have a diverse employee base?
Yep.
Where do they actually sit? Are they back to a fund level? Are they partners? Are they sitting mainly on the legal and fundraising side, as it very often is in private capital, right? Or where are those women actually sitting? So I would then strongly encourage the investors to measure over time. So start measuring today, create a baseline, and then let's start setting realistic targets. Let's then basically circle back in 12 months' time, and let's do the same exercise again. And let's see how the needle has moved. Usually, I mean, even in the venture space, you will have, you will stay in the startup for 3, 5, 7 years. So I would argue just by putting those kind of measures and regular check-in points in place, you will move the needle. You will at least give the startup food for thought. Next time they're hiring, should we make an effort to just have a more diverse pool initially of the candidates that we're looking at once we're putting them through? Secondly, I think one part that keeps coming up in my conversations quite regularly now is diversity in the context of AI. And that obviously is a very complicated conversation. And I have to say, for myself, I'm just starting to look at that and have conversations and also educate myself and observe what is being done. There are some VCs that really have said, we're aware this is a complicated topic, but we really want to get comfortable with that because of the impact that AI will arguably have in the next decades on all of us. So they're arguing that we gotta somehow get this right. We may not get it right in the first or second attempt, but for us as an investor in specifically AI-focused startups, we need to at least get to the point where we can ask the right questions and maybe guide our startups in the right direction. I mean, that starts with training data and so on. I mean, you're aware of all the issues in the AI context. And I agree that it's important to get this right, but I also have to say, I do not have a kind of perfect model that I can pull out of the hat and say, this is what I've seen, this is how it works, let's move in that direction, but it's important.
There's so much to unpack, but first on the AI versus human, clearly it's shifting the filters of people and the biases to data that is today, and therefore it captures the biases that has been from past decisions, which means that if you didn't have good diversity of thoughts and you didn't invest in the right diverse teams, the data you have is what it is. So I think it's extremely dangerous to use AI without asking the right questions. So I think I can't agree more with that. I think there is such a huge responsibility for us, corporate VCs and VCs, because when we invest in startups, we're looking at the early life of a company, which we hope will become a massive company. And to shift the needle even slightly towards diversity will end up with a much major impact towards the later life of the company. So I think everything you said, I can't agree more with. It's spot on.
Yeah, no, it's and if you see anyone who's doing something interesting there, or would like to have more conversations, I'd be happy to, because I agree with you. It's early days. We don't have anything in place right now. We should develop something over time. But it's really, really crucial to get it right, because you're right. You have a responsibility as an early investor, and maybe we've never thought about this in the past so much. Nevertheless, if you go back all the way to the starting point of venture capital, and you look at some of the writings of Georges Doriot, that's exactly what it was. It was encouraging, mentoring, fostering, guiding, and being a sounding board to those startups. And if this was important in the 1950s, I think nowadays it's going to be super important. Even if we are just very conservative with the assumption on the impact that AI will have on all our lives. even with conservative assumptions, it's really worthwhile to spend time on that and get it right.
Absolutely. Actually, you make me think of one question, which I don't think we can answer because that means a parallel universe. But can you imagine if Google, their VC had insisted that on top of Larry and Sergey, they would have had to have a third female co-founder? What would Google be today?
That's a really interesting experiment. So we have a lot of alumni inside Google. I could do a survey amongst them and see basically, we get it from the horse's mouth. How would this have looked like? But a super interesting question. I mean, and you know, I have one startup I basically just had a conversation with, and they do have a female founder in it, but they're very kind of on the deep tech side, and they're just basically saying, and I said, well, you guys just hired someone else, and it was yet another guy. So how many women did you have? And they said, well, we didn't have any women that even applied, or we had one, and that became very clear this was not a good fit. So you know, we're doing our best, but this is what we're doing. It's hard for those startups to even create a starting point, right, where they have female candidate or just diverse candidates. It's very easy for us. I mean, we know that my OB colleagues have done decades of research on it. We tend to fall into the bucket where we like to hire people that are like us. So that's just, and we need to constantly basically fight that urge to do so.
I think there's one more thing you said, which I want to zoom in, which is a slicing of the data, even for gender, with the investing power. I think you could have a VC with 50-50, but if all four partners are male, it's not the investing power that's diverse. So I think having that kind of granularity of where the investing power is and what is a trend. I think the data is one thing, but looking at the trends is really what's useful to watch. And therefore for VCs, CVCs, for LPs to ask not just gender numbers, but also the investing power gender, I think that actually would be very useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, there are efforts going on right now various regulators have started to come out with frameworks. So, and they may not be perfect, but as always, we have to have a starting point, right? And we will iterate around that. I just saw this morning on the private equity side that CalPERS together with Carlyle, basically together with ILPA, with the Big Investor Association, basically launched a new a framework or a tool that allows basically investors and funds to measure what's happening in their portfolio companies. So that's brand new. So there are efforts going on. I would argue that within the next 12 to 18 months, we will have much more clarity on the baseline or what a baseline should be when you're trying to measure diversity, when you're trying to measure even broader around anything related to ESG. It will improve because there's lots of, how should I say, unhappiness, both on the investor side as well as on the fund side. And, you know, uncertainty is usually not good for either side of the table.
Very nice. You talked about students, and you have students who want to go into corporate VCs. What would you recommend for them to be better prepared to join a corporate VC?
Okay, I think it's useful to have experience inside a corporate, just the workings of a corporate, not necessarily on the, or specifically not on the CVC side, just to have either worked with a corporate or worked inside a corporate. So you kind of get what makes or breaks corporate, or what is corporate culture. So you have a pretty good idea, because that will help you to understand that the corporate culture and thinking inside a corporate is quite different from thinking on in an entrepreneurial environment or on the startup side. And marrying the two is complicated. So you should be kind of aware of the challenges that the role comes with. And I think then if you're basically going to go and join a CVC, it helps if you had entrepreneurial experience. Maybe you've had your own startup, so you can relate to what it means like to sitting on the other side of the table. You can relate to what those founders basically deal with. You're a much more empathetic investor. And obviously, I mean, it may help that you have an understanding on verticals. So let's say you come with a background, maybe not a background in AI. I think would be probably a bit of a tall ask, but if you do, by all means, you will find a lot of open doors, at least for a conversation. But an understanding on anything related to computer science, what is going on right now, be it on the B2B side, be it on the B2C side, I think that's very useful. But I think joining a CVC, having a bit of experience on the entrepreneurial side is useful, but clearly having an appreciation of the challenges of what corporates usually struggle with would be useful to kind of help you manage your expectations.
I think what you're implying is that empathy for the corporation, empathy for the entrepreneurs will make you a better corporate VC and investor.
Yeah, and knowledge that it's a full-on job. So it's not, VCs, contrary to popular belief, actually do really work hard. So I hear founders always sometimes say like, yeah, you know, he's VC. I mean, what does he do? He just takes a couple of meetings. So that's kind of like the easy part. We're doing the heavy lifting. So we got to give the VCs a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. They actually do work hard.
So let me ask, you talk about having been an entrepreneur is useful. Do you think it's even more useful if you have been an entrepreneur that didn't succeed or an entrepreneur that did succeed?
To be honest, I think it doesn't matter, because I mean, looking at what the founders that I work with, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, in my, if you call it portfolio, you know, the statistics are no different. So the ones that have learned, even the ones that may have just joined a startup for a certain period of time, it's incredibly useful to be part of that. So I wouldn't draw the line there. Both experiences are useful.
Yeah, I agree. I really can't trip you on any questions, so this is really good. Let's talk about impact investing. Clearly, it's very encouraging. The trends are really good. Is there one element of impact investing you are most excited about and one you are most worried about?
Yes, and I mean, let me just broaden the spectrum a bit. So, and maybe just the definition. So impact investing, and I think those definitions are slowly filtering down and becoming standard. So impact investing usually is defined as investing in companies that are specifically designed to create, to ensure a sustainable solution to a problem, usually inside an underprivileged and underrepresented community. So, and that's nowadays still one of the smallest spaces, nevertheless, potentially, and if I say small space in terms of capital deployed, nevertheless, it's the one that has probably the biggest impact, for lack of a better word, but also the greatest need still.
Potential.
Then you jump to the other side, and we're talking about anything related to ESG-based investing. And there, I mean, we've just seen this explosion of funds, large funds on the private capital side that are deploying and are looking for investable assets. But for them, clearly, the screen is first financial returns, then basically E, S, or G improvement. So the pitch there is, dear investor, we can have financial returns and we in line with standard, let's say, private capital returns, and we basically can improve E, S, or G in our portfolio companies. And there, I would argue, we've raised so much money in the last, since 2017, 18, that it's really, really hard for LPs as well to separate the wheat from the chaff. It goes back to what we talked about earlier on. It goes back to measurability. We, as of right now, we still don't have a kind of industry standard that allows us to compare apples with apples. That is changing, so it will be changing. The European regulators have come out with something, and we can have a conversation around it, whether it's useful or not. It will be improved. The SEC is coming out with something different on institutions, different industry bodies are coming up with measures. So I think it's moving in the right direction. But right now, I can tell you it's super confusing. And it's not just confusing for me, it's confusing to every LP that I'm talking to. The LPs are trying to get their head around, what does this even mean internally? When I have, let's say, a capital allocation to private capital of 25% of my assets under management, and now I'm being told that 5% of that has to go into anything related to impact. What does it even mean? So it's really hard to define it nowadays, but I think this will change. So in general, what I'm excited about is the fact that compared to even 2014-15, the conversation around it now is the noise level is much higher. So again, I like to believe that this will ultimately lead to more conversations around climate change, to real scrutiny on whether you are saying you're doing what you're doing is actually really good for the environment. Does it have the impact? Should you be allowed to just simply, you know, buy your carbon credits and live happily ever after? And, you know, how do we basically compare that then? An investor that has just divested from anything related to carbon to an investor that basically, or a fund that has said, no, we're going to stay and we're going to fight. We're going to kind of get engaged. It's complicated, but we're willing to have those complicated conversations. Right now, I mean, even the investors are being kind of left alone, if you like, with that decision. And I think that's not good. I think we need a baseline. We need a better measure. Just to also kind of keep all those investors honest, to really kind of hold their feet to the fire and say, you're saying A, are you doing A? Are you walking the talk? So, and we're not quite there yet, but I think the efforts are going in the right direction. So I'm excited about that.
I agree. It's totally critical, because otherwise all these conversations happening will lead to disappointment. But with very clear definition, very good way of measuring, you remove the subjectivity as much as possible, and then you can see who has really done an impact, a positive impact, versus the one that have been talking about it but not delivering.
Absolutely.
So, I think anything that the audience can contribute in defining better and measuring, this matters way more than just talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, clearly, I mean, we know there's work to be done, right? I mean, we know that corporates could kind of change their view a little bit. We could encourage startups to have from the get-go a view on how their activity is impacting their community, how they can be better players or better members of their specific environment. And there's, again, as an investor, VC or private equity, you have impact, right? I mean, those companies are with you for a significant amount of time. So, and you usually sit on the board, you usually engage with the entrepreneurs. So there is value in you having this as one of your mandates or as one of your check-in points in regular intervals.
It's so important. Actually, at TDK Ventures, every investment committee pitch we make, the first slide, we show which ESG we believe the startup can contribute to.
Interesting.
And this is interesting because it engages a conversation, and hopefully people get challenging. Are you sure? Why? And how much? So this is really good. We're getting to the top of the hour. Is there anything you want to tell the audience who are CVC wannabes or already practicing corporate venturing to really drive the industry to do good?
I would argue that anyone needs to nowadays keep a closer eye on the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And if you feel, even if you don't want to be an investor, if you feel you need to engage, or you want to engage because you have something to contribute, I think it's in all our interest that we make, or that we help those entrepreneurs, of which we have arguably more today than we ever had before in history, that we help those entrepreneurs build their new businesses, their new products, so they are sustainable, that they have staying power, and that they are ultimately participants in an environment and contribute in a good way to society. So if you would like to engage more, you want to just have conversation around it, I'd be happy to have that conversation and play your devil's advocate. But be warned, I will be asking tricky questions. So I will be asking difficult questions. It won't be a cozy, feel-good conversation on ESG in a cozy, hug the tree and save the polar bears kind of sense.
Okay, I look forward to it now. I think you touch on what I think should be the ultimate goal of VCs and CVCs, which is to be impact scaler. Because the startups themselves are meant to be impact scaler, to scale impact, contribute to society. And a VC or CVC does a good job is going to be this impact scaler of impact scalers.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would also encourage, maybe on top of it, everyone, whether you're a startup, an investor, or an LP, share your experience with the audience, with everyone. Try to find a way to make your experiences, your mistakes, but also your positive learnings with everyone. I'm a big believer in open source structures. So put it back to the community and let the community react to it. Right now, we need it because right now there is no benchmark. So any experience that you can share is better than what we have right now. So if it has worked, that's great, but also share if it did not work or if you were disappointed with the outcome. So I think that would be really, really useful.
This is a great way to finish a great interview. Claudia, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you, Nicolas. It was a pleasure. It's nice to be on the other side. So I get to be questioned. So I would be happy to come back. So thanks very much. And I look forward to seeing more questions.
Thank you, Claudia. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.